All right, welcome back from your break. We're just going to pick up again with these biogeographic regions and their connections to plate tectonics. So you can see as these plates have moved around, they have either brought new species into contact with one another or separated them through time. And so what's going on basically, if you haven't stopped to think much about plate tectonics, is that out in the middle of the ocean, there are these mid-oceanic ridges that are there's lava coming up and spreading the plates apart. And this is where new land surfaces are created. And then as they spread apart very, very slowly, they come into contact with other plates and collide, and they form these subduction zones where one plate sinks under the other. And that's often where you have mountain formation and you have volcanoes. So all around the Pacific Rim, where we have this ring of fire, we have plate subduction, and we have the creation of volcanoes and mountain ranges. And this is all interesting because over time, these plates have moved around dramatically. And so if you go back to the early Triassic, about 251 million years ago, we have all the continents had kind of drifted together into a giant continent called Pangaea. And then about 100 million years ago, that Pangaea continent started to break apart into two kind of parts. One was called Gondwana, and the other was called Laurasia. And you can see the colors of these continental plates kind of are maintained through time, and they show you how North America and the European continent kind of have been part of the same grouping of continents for a very long time, and that South America, Africa, and India and Australia were part of this other group. And so by the early Paleogene, 60 million years ago, you can start to see some of our current day continents. They were still much closer together, but then they've started to drift apart. And so what's neat about that is that these continents have some shared fossils and some shared evolutionary history. And then, as continents like the Indian subcontinent collided with the European continent and created the Himalayan mountain range, you get this really, really cool kind of convergence of very different types of species coming into contact for the first time. Similar to what happened, although you can't see it very well, in Indonesia, which is what Wallace was really exploring. So for the most part, we talked about how the tropics, I guess the tropics have a lot of diversity. That isn't necessarily true for things like seabirds. So seabirds actually have the highest species richness in both the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere in the polar and temperate regions. And the tropics are actually kind of species poor in terms of seabirds. But for most other organisms, the tropics do show the highest diversity. And so why? Why the tropics, right? So this is kind of one of these big unanswered questions in ecology. And it also has a lot of potential hypotheses that we're still trying to explore. So the first one is that if you look at these species richness, not over area graphs, but species richness through time graphs, if you go back kind of through time, like we were talking about the plate tectonic movements, what might have happened in the tropics versus the temperate zones to increase diversity. So first of all, maybe there's just a higher diversification rate in the tropics, as shown by the red line in the far left. And if that's the case, then you have more species richness over time. What if it's just that there's been more time for species to diversify in the tropics? Because the temperate zones might have been covered by ice, right? And so if you're covered by ice, there's not likely to be much diversity at all. And the tropics were never covered by ice. And so there's just been more time for diversity to develop in the tropics. And that would be kind of the middle graph, or B. Or what if it's based on productivity of the ecosystem? So we know the tropics are very productive, lots of plant material, lots of biomass, right? So way more biomass in a tropical rainforest than the tundra. And so if productivity is driving species richness and diversity, then you might just have higher productivity in the tropics. So these are three hypotheses, and they're competing, but they might also coalesce. So they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. And so here's some other things that might have influenced species richness in the tropics. One is just land area. So if you look, the southern hemisphere, there's not much land at all. You have South America, you have Africa, and you have Australia. In terms of total land area, most of the land area in the southern hemisphere is subtropical. Most of the land area in the northern hemisphere is equally distributed among subtropical, temperate, boreal, and tundra habitats. But the tropics make up this huge percentage of the land area on Earth. And so maybe it's just that they're the largest area. So all of the things that we're learning about in terms of species richness and area might come into play with this exploration of just land area. And the other thing is that temperatures are very stable in the tropics. So if you look at figure B at the bottom, you can see that from 0 latitude to about 20, which is where we consider the tropics, temperatures on average are between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius. And then very dramatically, after you hit about 30 degrees latitude, temperatures drop all the way down to -20. There's a steep decline. And so just, having temperatures be a relatively stable part of the physical environment might lead to overall species richness developments. Okay, so we're going to finish the rest of this chapter. We're going to focus really on species area curves, and there are follow-up lectures on the chalkboard, the whiteboard. So species area curves are these relationships between species richness on the y-axis and area on the x-axis. And if you plot species richness over area, if you're sampling a larger and larger area, or just the number of samples that you're collecting increases the area of your overall sample collection, you should get this kind of nice curve that you see in the top graph if you plot them in their raw form. Now, if you take the log of the number of species and the log of area and you plot them, you should get a very nice straight linear model, a line. Okay, so species area curves plot species richness of a sample or of an island. We'll talk about island biogeography too, against area in meters squared. And the relationship between S and A is estimated by linear regression. And so you can use this, this equation from the book, species richness equals Z times the area plus C, which is the y-intercept, if you are plotting the log-log. The steeper the slope, the greater the difference in species richness among sites. So this is kind of the simple description that comes from the textbook. And we're going to go into a lot more depth when we go on to the board. So this theory of, this idea that species richness increases with area was kind of explored further in what's called the theory of island biogeography. If you think about islands are a great example because you have small islands off the coast of some mainland, like in the figure on the right, versus large islands. You might predict that a large island would be a bigger kind of target and more species would arrive on a large island than a small island. You might also predict that more species might arrive on an island that's close to the mainland versus an island that's far from the mainland. So this is a model that talks about the number of species, this time on the x-axis. You can see the number of species on x. And y represents rates. And the two rates are immigration rate in red and the extinction rate in blue. And we can predict the number of species on a given island by modeling basically extinction rates and immigration rates. And this model was put forward by Robert MacArthur and E.O. Wilson in the 60s. And it was followed up by a pretty interesting experiment by E.O. Wilson and his student Dan Simberloff in this classic experiment that kind of experimentally tested these theories by going to these mangrove islands and taking whole islands and covering them with plastic and fumigating them. So basically killing all of the insects on the island and then allowing them to recover. And so this is a pretty extreme experiment. It would be hard to get a permit to do this today, most likely, but what you can see in the figure is that you have The dotted line shows you the number of species on a near island in blue and a far island in red before they did any of the defaunation, which is a nice way of killing things, of saying that you killed things. And then they defaunated a near island and a far island, and then watched species recover. And so what you can see is that on a near island, it only took about a year for the number of species on the island to recover to the pre kind of killing event, right? But the far island didn't recover after a year. It was still much lower. And so you can see this kind of experimentally proves that far islands have a much harder time when it comes to immigration rates, and probably also have higher extinction rates. So this research, we're gonna follow up and talk a lot more about these kinds of models. But I just want you to know that there are also a lot of scientists continuing to study this in other places too. And so this is Jose Maria Fernandez Palacios, and he just published a paper this year or last year exploring how sea level shifts might have influenced islands because of this relationship between species richness and area since the last glacial maximum 21,000 years ago. And so you can see how sea level rise might have actually changed both the area and potentially the distances between mainlands and islands, but it also might have changed the size of islands. And so that's kind of a cool application that has to do with climate change and species area relationships. Okay, I think that wraps it up, and I will see you next time.